Okay, so hello everyone, good afternoon and good morning to you also, those of you who are not here in our part of the continent. So we are today's seminar. Welcome again to CSPS, the Social Policy Seminar. And today we have with us Professor Daniel Beland from McGill University, Canada, who will be giving us a presentation on titled Ideas, Institutions, and Global Social Policy. So Professor Beland is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada and James McGill Professor in Department of Political Science in the same university. So he's held several visiting academic positions at Harvard University, the University of Bremen, the University of Nagoya, and also the University of Southern Denmark. Currently, he serves as the executive director of the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis and president of the Research Committee 19, that is on poverty, social welfare, and social policy of the International Sociological Association. He's also published more than 20 books and 170 peer-reviewed journal articles. So we are very happy and glad to have you. And we are looking forward to a very insightful session. And please, you can have your presentation and then we'll follow up with Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation. I'm glad to be with you virtually. Of course, I hope that someday I can meet you all in person, those I have not met before. So those who are familiar with my work won't be surprised about the topic of this talk, what I will discuss today. I've published about this for nearly 20 years, but I wanted to discuss some of these concepts to see how you find them useful for your own work. So I decided to give a kind of big picture talk, drawing on some of the things I've written before. And I will start by actually, acknowledge my collaborators for Ghana, who are all proud graduates of the University of Ghana. And several of them have returned to Ghana to teach at your university. And so Paul Boakie, Rosina Foley, Michael Pessa-White. His name was Michael Pessa when he was working with me as a postdoc, and Ishmael Vireko. And I know that Michael Pessa-White is here with us today, which is great. So Paul, Rosina, and Ishmael were my doctoral students at the University of Saskatchewan, and Michael was a postdoc. He came to work with me after he completed his PhD at McMaster University in Canada. So I salute them, and I've worked with them on some of the theoretical issues that I will talk about today. And so I have a special connection to Ghana through these wonderful people. So today I will talk about the role of ideas and institutions in global social policy. And I will begin with a discussion of types of explanation in political science research before exploring institutionalism and the role of ideas in broad terms. And then hopefully in the discussion, we'll see how this might or might not apply to Ghana and to sub-Saharan Africa more generally. This framework was really developed in the context of the global north, but quite a few people, including some of my friends I've mentioned just earlier, have been using some of these tools, adapting them to study Ghana and other sub-Saharan African countries. So of course, I've cited him a lot over the years, Craig Parsons, in his book, How to Map Arguments in Political Science. When we want to explain specific outcomes in political analysis, we can turn to 4 different types of explanation: material or structural explanations, institutional explanations, psychological explanations, and ideational explanations. And of course, these 4 types of explanation in reality can overlap, We have to disentangle them analytically. And we can also combine types of explanation when we cannot explain a specific puzzle, a specific research question, drawing on only one of these types of explanation. So today I will focus primarily on ideational explanations as they can be combined with institutional explanations. So both ideational and institutional explanations are particular in nature. They are related to a specific historical context. We have to, when we study them, we have to take into account the weight of historical legacies in a particular setting. And that's what they have in common. But they are also different because ideational explanations are about the logic of interpretation according to which political actors and other people give meaning to the world surrounding them. And institutional explanations are about the logic of position. It's about how the specific position of actors within national and sometimes transnational institutions affect their behavior. So my starting point theoretically is institutionalism. And of course, when you talk about social policy research, institutionalism has been really influential. We think here, for example, about the work of Esping Anderson and Paul Pearson, focusing on the global north, but their work has also been adapted to the study of the global south. And I would say that institutionalism, which really crystallized in the 1980s and early mid-1990s, really stressed stability over change. And now there are, of course, over the last 15 years, a number of scholars like Cathy Tellen have decided to re-emphasize or emphasize pathways to transformative change within existing institutions. And so today I will really take part in that push to emphasize both stability and change in institutions, including social policy institutions, for example, existing social programs. I think that the literature on change, on institutional change, is really tied to the literature on the role of ideas in social policy. And many people have written about this in recent decades. So, of course, when we talk about ideas or ideational processes, it's extremely broad. Here we can define simply ideas as historically constructed beliefs, causal beliefs of individuals and collective actors. And I think the concept of ideas is really broad. And so it's good to break down ideas into different subcategories that we can study empirically. So policy paradigms is a very important concept. We talk about how different ideas are tied to one another in terms of how specific problem definitions are tied to policy solutions. So in a way, policy paradigms are a cluster of ideas that we find, for example, in economic policy, when we talk about Keynesianism and monetarism, for example. When we talk about ideas, we can also focus on public sentiments, which is about public opinion and also cultural representations of ordinary people and how this may affect social policy over time. These two paradigms and public sentiments are a bit, according to John L. Campbell, are the background of the policy process for the most part. And then at the foreground of the policy process, you have specific programs, like programs that political parties can put forward, or different, I would say, agendas that actors promote. And then you have frames. Frames are the strategic ways in which political actors depict a problem or a potential solution to it. So how they try to influence the perceptions of the public and of other actors within their political system. And so frames are really try to tap on or shape public sentiments while programs, on average, they tend to reflect existing policy paradigms. Of course, in addition to paradigms, public sentiments, programs, and frames, you have other types of ideas that we can identify and study. Political ideologies like conservatism or liberalism, of course, are important. And also problem definitions per se, which can exist in the context of specific policy paradigms, but they have also a life of their own. So how do we define, understand poverty, and how do we understand spousal violence, or how do we understand unemployment? Problem definitions are really essential to understand policy debates and how specific solutions might be crafted in response to these perceived problems. So, of course, problems have an objective structural side, but they are also about perceptions, how we define these problems. And then we have social policy concepts like the concept of, say, welfare state or social insurance. And these are concepts that are much debated and that can also shape public understandings and policy debates over time. So when we talk about the role of ideas, I messed up with my numbers here, but they are talk about, yes, there are 5 different, no, it actually works. 5 different main moments of the policy cycle, and ideas are present. The different types of ideas I talked about earlier are present across the policy cycle. Ideas play a central role in shaping the agenda, especially through framing contests, where different, and also problem definition, where actors try to promote specific problems, move them onto the agenda, and when they are on the agenda, frame them in certain ways. And so agenda setting is very important. Of course, space on the agenda is limited. If you talk about the policy agenda or even the media agenda, normally there are only a few items that are really at the forefront, at the center of this agenda. And so there is competition among different actors to promote certain issues onto the agenda. And I think this is very important, the agenda setting side of social policy. Of course, different actors can play a role in agenda setting. They can be local actors, national actors, but also transnational actors like international organizations like the World Bank. Then we talk about policy formulation, when experts and policymakers try to design solutions, potential solutions to these problems that move in and out of the policy agenda, because the agenda is always in flux and can be quite unstable, right? So policy formulation is actually more stable. It's often the work of academics, of experts, of people who think about these potential policy solutions. So they work on policy design, and they can promote specific policy solutions, specific policy instruments. So there are actors who promote specific problems onto the agenda, and other actors, and sometimes it's the same, they overlap, who promote specific policy solutions, like promoting social insurance or promoting cash transfers, right? We call this instrument constituency, and I've written about instrument constituencies with Michael Howlett and others, but I won't discuss that today. And then there is decision-making, of course, when normally elected officials, sometimes bureaucrats, will actually select one of the available policy solution and enact it. It can be done through parliament. Sometimes it's more bureaucratic or a combination of both. But it's normally when the policy is enacted. And then you have, of course, a very important policy area, which is implementation. And of course, ideas play a role in implementation too, especially public sentiments because how people will react, ordinary people will react to a policy is very important, but framing is also important. How bureaucrats, civil servants, sometimes journalists will frame new policies and will try to affect the way they are perceived. I've written about policy implementation and the role of ideas with Valérie Ride. And actually, it's an article that focuses on sub-Saharan Africa and the issue of healthcare reform. And I do think that, ideas play a role at the implementation level as well. And then there is policy evaluation, which is all about the role of ideas in a sense. It's about drawing lessons from existing policies and about framing these lessons in a way that could feed into agenda setting. For example, if we find that the program is perceived as or that the program is not effective in, say, fighting poverty, then of course this can promote this issue onto the agenda. So there is a tie between policy evaluation and agenda setting. In fact, all of these 5 moments of the policy cycle overlap, and sometimes they also are closely tied to one another. But I think that's a stylized way to look at the policy process and also see that ideas matter at all of these stages of policy making and policy development. As I said, the least studied of these moments in general, and especially from the perspective of the role of ideas, is policy implementation. And I think it requires more attention. And here I mentioned the article that I wrote with Valérie Ride some years ago, which you can access. It's an open access. It's easy to find. If you Google Beland Ride implementation, you will find it probably right away. Now, an important aspect of the literature on the role of ideas and social policy is about the construction of interests. So interests, of course, have an objective side, right? In the sense that interests are likely to reflect the economic and institutional position of both individuals and collective actors. At the same time, interests are also constructed in the sense that you have to give a meaning to them, and you have to derive, say, preferences from your own assessment of your position within society and within the political system. So that's here there is a relationship between what Craig Parsons calls the logic of position and the logic of interpretation. Too often, I think in the literature, we focus almost exclusively on the logic of position, the objective position of actors, and how this affects their preferences. But in fact, there is the other side of the equation, the other side of the politics of interest, which is about how actors really perceive the world and perceive their own interests. And so preferences are not just derived from the objective position of actors, but how they assess their own position and their relationship to other actors. It's also important to understand that when we talk about coalitions, which is about an aggregation of different interests and actors sharing them, ideas can play a major role in bringing people together, especially through the use of ambiguous, broad ideas that have positive valence, that have a positive meaning, like solidarity, social inclusion, and sustainability, for example. And I've written about all these topics in the past. Now, when we study the role of ideas, I think it's important to also understand that ideas just don't float, above actors. Ideas are promoted, defended, diffused by specific actors, but these actors, although they have agency, they have some autonomy, they also face institutional constraints and opportunities. That's why many people who study the role of ideas also emphasize institutional factors. And we talk here about formal political institutions, hierarchy systems, but also policy legacies, and how existing policies create their own inertia and their own political forces over time, in a way. And when we talk about global social policy, we also have to understand that transnational diffusion processes are mediated by domestic actors and political institutions. And here I refer to the work of Mitchell Orenstein, his book on pension privatization around the world, and he shows that domestic factors do mediate the impact of transnational actors like international organizations. This, of course, discussion leads to a critique of the imposition thesis that some of my students from Ghana have written about before, have criticized, people have mentioned earlier. Of course, international organizations can impose their will through sanctions and through financial incentives, but a lot of what international organizations and actors do is actually they try convincing domestic actors and even sometimes the public that certain policy solutions are better than others. So there is a role here for framing processes and for other ideational processes I've discussed before. More concretely, ideas can impact ways in which political actors bring about policy change. For example, there is this literature that I mentioned earlier. I mentioned Cathy Tellen about transformative yet incremental change, where policy actors will use strategies that are really gradual in nature. They cannot really change policies in a sudden way. So they will be a bit sneaky in a way, and they will use more indirect long-term strategies to revise policies. For example, layering, when you add a new policy on the top of existing policies in the hope that this policy will grow over time. And certainly ideas will also affect how layering and other forms of incremental strategies are implemented. And certainly this is not just, the preferences of actors regarding these strategies are not just about their position, their material and institutional position, but also about their interpretation of the world surrounding them and what their preferences are in relationship to their position. Now, a key issue when we talk about the role of ideas is methodological in nature. And that's why we need to develop rigorous methods to study the role of ideas. The first thing to do, of course, is to define ideas and the different subcategories that I discussed earlier, drawing on the work of John L. Campbell. We need to define what we mean by ideas. We need then to break down the concept of ideas into specific subcontexts that are easier to study. We do that when we study institutions, right? We talk about, unitary states versus federal states. We talk about parliamentary systems versus presidential systems, and so forth. So when we talk about institutions, political institutions or policy institutions, we break down this concept. The same thing with ideas. In fact, the concept of idea is not more abstract than the concept of institution or the concept of interest. But we need to give flesh to that concept and break it down and study different types of ideas over time. At the same time, understanding how these ideas exist and interact with other factors that can be psychological factors about how the brain works, including cognitive shortcuts. We can talk about these institutions, and I've discussed the role of institutions very briefly earlier. And of course, also, and then I repeated psychological explanations, but here I'm talking about structural explanations, so material factors like geography and economic cycles. Of course, it's hard to disentangle all these four types of explanation, but I think that we need to operationalize them and be able to study them empirically. Methodologically, of course, to be a bit more concrete, I think process tracing is an important way to study the role of ideas by studying the development of these ideas over time and how different actors use them in a detailed and rigorous manner. So I think here, for example, the work of Alan Jacobs on a process tracing and the role of ideas is really important here. So it's really about how ideas evolve over time, but in close relationship to the actors who diffuse them and convey them. Now, something that is not so common in the research about the role of ideas is quantitative research, although there is more of this work now than, say, 20 years ago when I started working on this. But there are ways to quantify the influence of ideas on the agenda, for example. You can, use, for example, agenda setting in terms of media coverage and study how many times, say, a word is used or a phrase is used in the newspapers over time to study agenda setting. So I think in terms of agenda setting, there's already a lot of quantitative methods and data available. But for the other aspects of the policy process, when we talk about the role of ideas, there is less quantitative research available. But I think that for each of the four other moments of the policy process I've talked about earlier, so in terms of policy formulation, decision-making, implementation, and policy evaluation, I think that we can develop quantitative measures that can complement qualitative tools that we have in terms of process tracing, in terms of qualitative interviews, in terms of content and discourse analysis. So there are a lot of tools available out there that students who are interested in the role of ideas have really used over the years. And I think it's important to pay attention to these methodological challenges. What Craig Parsons shows us in his book, How to Map Arguments in Political Science, is that it is possible to study ideas empirically in a rigorous manner. And often ideas have a bad name because people say it's too abstract, or you can't measure them, or you can't really study them in a rigorous manner. But in fact, there is a lot of empirical work about the global north and increasingly about the global south that suggests that studying the role of ideas in a broader institutional context is actually really fruitful empirically and can really be based on a systematic methodological take. And so I think this is something that we, of course, need to talk more about moving forward, the methodological side of ideas. And certainly I would like to hear your reactions about this. Frankly, these methods exist already in social science research and methods that have been used to study institutions or structural factors can be adapted to study the role of ideas in many ways. At the same time, we have to be mindful of the fact that if we focus on the social construction of the world, or at least how people give meaning to the world, there are some basic epistemological realities that we have to take into account. So we cannot just, do quantitative research when you study the role of ideas, like if this was about objective reality only. We have to understand that numbers and statistics are also socially and historically constructed, which doesn't prevent us from using them. Also, when you study the role of ideas, we can still recognize the existence of facts. Studying the role of ideas is not just about, studying a kind of parallel universe or something that is disconnected from facts, that we can agree on basic facts, and then study how these different facts can receive different interpretations. And there's a struggle over the meaning of these facts, but we can agree on basic facts. And I think this is important to keep that in mind when we study the role of ideas. In conclusion, ideas are only one aspect of the explanatory tools that we have available to us in social science research and social policy. So I'm not saying here we should drop all the research about structural inequalities, or about institutions, or about psychological shortcuts and cognitive factors at the individual level. But I do think that paying close attention to the role of ideas, especially the specific types of ideas that I've discussed earlier, like framing processes, political ideologies, public sentiments, and so forth, is something that can help us understand the conditions under which policy change becomes possible. But again, the study of the role of ideas should take into account the interaction between specific types of ideas and the actors that promote them or oppose them, with other explanatory factors. I have emphasized here institutions because they have quite a bit in common, because they are both historically constructed, and we emphasize this historical construction when we study both ideas and institutions. But we should not neglect also structural and psychological factors as potential explanations, and also as factors that can interact with one another. Overall, ideas do not explain everything. I think it's important to understand that. But I think it's a relevant factor for social policy scholars that we should keep in mind when we study both stability and change in social policy. I've spoken for 30 minutes and 35 seconds, so I'm right on time, and I will stop here so that we can have a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Beland. Thank you for being right on time, and I believe that our audience really enjoyed your presentation. So now the floor is open. Please raise a hand and I'll call you to ask a question if there's anyone with any burning questions so far. Let me see. You can also send your questions or comments in the chat. Are there any questions so far? Okay, there's a hand up. Who is it? Let me see.
Nana.
Nanekia, yes, please go ahead.
Hello, Professor Beland. Thank you so much for this. This was really interesting. A few years ago, must have been a while ago, I was writing an article on Ghana at 50. So Ghana celebrating its jubilee, I guess from anniversary from colonial rule. Anywho, I wanted to talk about how people were thinking about the celebrations and their critique of it and their sense of how far the country had come. And I found myself very limited in the sense that I had to use newspaper articles. And I was very conscious of the fact that newspapers were written by some segment of the population, was accessible to only some segment of the population. And I found it very limiting. Of course, this is going to be a concern anywhere in the world, that there's a lot of conversation and circulation of ideas that happens orally, that happens on, like through radio discussions or television programs or on social media. Well, at least social media is written up, but, so, but obviously of more concern in a country that might be more oral than, written in the way that it communicates. And I wondered if you had thoughts about that. I suppose for trying to understand how policymakers are thinking, maybe much of that would be written up. But when we talk about public sentiments and public views of policy and so on, have you grappled with that?
Yes, this is a very, very good point. First of all, on when you talk about national identity, because I think that's what your paper dealt with, with Michael Pesa-White and others, we have actually written about this, even in the case of Ghana. And it's really I think it's directly related to the role of ideas, the construction of national identity. But and I've written about this, the relationship between ideas and identity formation. You know, I think that's when you talk about kind of grassroots public sentiments and things that, you know, is not part of the kind of elite discourse that you find in political speeches and say newspapers. I think here, of course, interviews are useful, but also focus groups. And I think focus groups are a method that can be used to tease out the kind of public sentiments. Of course, you have surveys, polls, which are useful, and I talk about the importance of quantitative research. I think that you can study public sentiments using polling data, right? But I do think that polling data should be complemented by either qualitative interviews with ordinary folks or opinion leaders in different communities, and or focus groups. And I think focus groups are something that is underutilized in the work about the role of ideas. When people come together and they discuss specific issues, and I think that this is something that should be helpful, especially in a context where, you know, oral transmission of knowledge is important. You mentioned also social media. I think that there is growing literature on social media that you can tie to the role of ideas. You can study agenda setting on you know, Twitter or other social media platforms. So I do think that there are a lot of methods available for this, and that public sentiments requires kind of in-depth study, and ideally you will have a poll with a relative representative sample, but polling doesn't always work. It can be done orally too, not necessarily in written form. But I do think that, you know, in that specific case, focus groups might be the way to go, with or without interviews on the top of it. So that requires, of course, some energy, some efforts. But I think that that might be an interesting way to do this. You
I
could.
think I was talking about, I should have given more context. I was talking about doing a sort of, it was a retrospective. So it was looking over the past year about the kind of debates that had come up. And so those that
50
were
years ago.
fossil, well, over time, right? So, but in fact, it was just for 1 year, a period of 1 year. So sort of trying to understand what the kinds of discourses around the celebrations were bubbling up, leading up to it. So those things that were falsified in newspapers, you could go back and look at, but then all the very vibrant discussions. But yes, I understand your point, though.
This is a major challenge when you study the past and you want to know about ordinary folks. So if you study the past, you know, in societies, oral societies, for example, you know, like our indigenous societies here, before colonization, there is very little that is written, right? There is nothing. There was no. So how do we reconstruct the past? How do we know how these people thought? Some of the stories are still, you know, have been transmitted through the ages, but it's very, very hard. And if you take, even if you study what happened 50 years ago, how do you know about how ordinary folks were thinking about, say, independence of Ghana? It's hard because the newspapers will reflect elite views for the most part. Is there any ethnographic documents that might be available? People, anthropologists or people who did field work at the time? Is there, you know, we have that we do in Canada now. We have oral histories of people who interview ordinary folks about how things were, or you know, and I'm not sure if you can find that, maybe through archival work. But I agree that often a lot of voices are silenced because they are not part of the elite discourse. And when these voices are located in the past, you can do a focus group with people who are dead. Well, you could try, but I suspect it won't work. So, you know, it's a very, very tricky question here. I think we have to speak to historians, our social historians, use different data sources to reconstruct public sentiments in the distant past. And I think historians have a lot to say about this, and much more than students of social policy like me. But thanks for your question. It's very, very important topic, I think, methodologically.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nanikia and Beland, for your delivery. So we have a question from Antoinette. Would you like to just go ahead and ask it, or I should read it? You can go ahead and ask so that he understands properly.
Okay, so hello, Daniel, and thank you very much. My thoughts were centering a little bit about how different ideologies. So when you keep saying ideas, I believe that ideas is what gives birth to ideologies. So you have the leftists, the rightist,
yes,
the different political parties and schools of thought. So would you then also agree that that kind of ideas also brings forth a different direction in social policy? So depending on which ideology you are thinking through, you would also be influenced by the way you then craft your social policies.
Absolutely. So ideologies, if you have different levels in terms of ideologies are among the I would say the broadest, the more general constructions, and yes, they do affect social policy in a direct way. For example, if you have a conservative ideology that might be centered, say, on traditional family values, might be even traditionally a patriarchal worldview and so forth, that will directly affect the way social policies are debated, perceived, and frankly, implemented over time. So I think that broad political ideologies, which typically are really, it's a worldview, but not only a worldview, but a set of broad prescriptions, sometimes even moral prescriptions about how the world should be. So that these broad ideologies, which are really about, how society should be organized, right? So should it be a central role of the state, or should it be centered more on markets and individual behavior, or more centered on the family? These broad political ideologies, which have been studied for a long time by people like, and more recently by people like Michael Frieden. If you're interested in political ideologies, there is a very good book by Michael Frieden, F-R-E-D-A-N, D-E-N, Michael Frieden, who's I think it's F-R-E-D-A-N, I think, who was Prof at Oxford, and he wrote a book called Ideologies, a short introduction at Oxford University Press, and it's a wonderful book about ideologies and how they can really affect politics over time. And I do think that the study of ideologies in social policy research, at least in the global north, is not really well articulated. People tend to focus on narrower constructs like policy paradigms, which are more technical in nature. But ideologies are really about norms, around how the world should be. What's the vision of society that you have in mind? Of course, they have their contradictions. They change over time. Politicians sometimes also are, borrowing from one ideology at the time, but certainly political parties tend to be aligned with one ideology or another. And that will affect, I think, their programs and also the policy solutions that they will find acceptable or not.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Michael, please, you can go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much. And Daniel, good to see you.
Good to hear you.
Yes. So this is quite an interesting presentation. Just to see whether you have a comment on what could be described as the power relations in ideational politics, as far as the global South is concerned.
Yes.
The historical trajectories and the historical dynamics of social policy and politics and the formation of state generally in the global South has been late compared to Western Europe and much of the industrialized world. And so, particularly from the post-war era, Western societies developed what now is known as a mature welfare state. And so they could afford to then begin to kind of reconfigure ideas based on, what the neoliberal ethos put forward. In the case of Africa and a lot of the countries in the global south, the social policy regimes were less developed, covered less people. Labor market was also very small, limited in scope, and so on and so forth. Then comes the 80s into the 90s, and social policy programs were basically, existing social policy programs in the global south were basically dismantled on the instruction, and I use the word instruction, of global actors. And since then, it appears that original, authentic ideas that could help address the realities in the global south found no space on the policy agenda, and policymakers in the global south are compelled to follow what is put forward by actors from the global north. I get the point when Orison argues that the policy imposition thesis is not as has been portrayed in the literature. But a critical evaluation of that argument suggests that the broad frame of the paradigm oftentimes is downloaded. What differs is the design, and the design is where the mediation of domestic factors actually come to play. I don't know if you have any comments on this at all.
Yeah, first of all, I think that even if you buy Ornstein's argument, you can still talk about domination, right? These are asymmetrical power relations. Regardless of whether you talk about imposition, sometimes it's imposition, sometimes it's not, in the sense that some domestic actors buy into some of these arguments or strategically embrace some policies that are recommended by international organizations. So I think that it's still asymmetrical power relations when you have, say, a poor country facing an international organization founded by the United States and other major powers like, say, the World Bank or the IMF. So I do think that asymmetrical power relations are very important. I've not discussed the concept of power here. I've published about the relationship between the concept of power and the role of ideas, an article I published in Policy Studies Review 12 years ago, and also I have a special issue of Journal of European Public Policy on the relationship between power and ideas. And I do think that you cannot study the role of ideas without paying attention to asymmetrical power relations. And that's especially true when we talk about the global south and the role of transnational actors. And that is, I think, very important. Now, when we talk about policy diffusion in the global south, we have seen some change, I would say, over the last decade. For example, over cash transfers. The influence of countries in the global south, middle-income country like Brazil, the example of Bolsa Familia, how this has diffused around the world. And also, we talk here about the policy idea that was not born or developed in the global north, but that was developed, in that case, in Latin America, and that has spread around the world, including in sub-Saharan Africa. And actually, with a few colleagues, including Rosina Foley, we published an article about that, about the diffusion of the cash transfer model from Brazil to Ghana. So I do think that diffusion is very important. And I do think that there is still, of course, asymmetrical power relations between countries in the global south and policy actors that are mainly founded by the global north. It can be countries, but I'm talking here about specifically international organizations. We have to recognize these asymmetrical power relations, and we have to understand how they intersect with the role of ideas. Certainly, the construction of interest is about power relations. You can try to convince other actors that it's in their interest to join you in a coalition. And that could be a way to resist against imposition or resist against these powerful external forces and actors. So I think your question is very important. The study of ideas in the global south and elsewhere should be leave a lot of room for an understanding of asymmetrical power relations, including domination. But understand that there are two sides of power. There's power over and power to. Power over is about domination, and certainly it's true in the case of imposition, but it can take more subtle ways. It can take more subtle forms, as sociologists like Pierre Bourdieu have written about, and people writing about colonialism and its legacies. They have written about this insidious ways in which domination can work. Frantz Fanon and others have written about that in a way. But in addition to power over, which is domination, there's also power to, which is the capacity of actors to act together, to form coalitions. Today, I've really emphasized the power to in my discussion about coalitions. Implicitly, I was talking about power to, power about capacity to reach certain goals and outcomes. Of course, in reality, power as domination and power as capacity, they interact and sometimes they can mesh, right? But often power to, actors will try to work together to oppose or resist imposition, power over. And I think studying the role of ideas within these battles, these power relations, is very important. And that's especially true in the global South when we deal with the relationship between specific countries, low or even middle income countries with international organizations that have a lot of financial clout, but also they have a lot of means to diffuse their ideas through conferences, through their networks in terms of expertise and so forth. So there is hard power of international organizations, as someone have written about, but also the soft power of international organizations, something that Mitchell Orenstein and others are writing about. Long answer, sorry.
No, very good answer. Thank you very much. Michael, are you satisfied?
No, absolutely. Yes,
Okay,
that's fine.
Great.
There are maybe a question or two in the chat that I have not answered, I think.
Yes,
Is it possible?
Yes. So there's one from Issa Musa, and he says, great work. Just a bit of clarification. Can the policy process also start with evaluations? Some researchers, for example, Anderson and Robert Easton, have widely given such explanations.
Yeah, I agree. It can start from, when we talk about the policy process and the 5 moments, they don't necessarily occur in the order that I've discussed earlier. This order is there because it's straightforward, it's intuitive, but in reality, and I'm drawing here on the work of Michael Howlett and his colleagues, yes, evaluation can trigger, as I said, agenda setting processes. And so, yes, policy change can begin with evaluation, especially when the evaluation of existing programs are really negative. And this information feeds the kind of policy loop, feeds into the policy loop, and people start to talk about the problems that these policies are creating or not solving. And it can be the start of the policy process. I totally agree with Easton and Anderson here, and with the fact that evaluation process can set the policy process in motion under some circumstances. It's not always the case though, but it can happen certainly, especially when you have a policy area where you have policies that have existed for a long time. Where it's a mature policy area, then it's even more likely that policy evaluation will trigger, set the policy process into motion.
Okay, thank you. The other question is from Jonathan Bildo, and he says that he got lost between what is an idea and a concept. So if you can say more about the differences between a concept and an idea.
So, ideas in general are causal beliefs, assumptions that people have about the world, their own position within the world, how things work and how they should work. So that's ideas in general. And then there are different subcategories. Then I talk about one of these subcategories, which is what we call the policy concepts. It's kind of a key word a key concept that is used by academics, but also in policy discourse. And I've quoted the book with Klaus Peterson on policy concepts. And I can actually give you the reference here. And it's actually a book that appeared in 2014. It's called Analyzing Social Policy Concepts and Language. So it's a book really about core social policy concepts as ideas, but ideas that are used by academics, but also by policymakers to make sense of social policy as a discipline, as a field. So that's this book that I was implicitly referring to. So social policy concepts here are just one type of ideas among many others. And I've discussed these other types earlier in my talk.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Maybe as we wait for the last few comments, I was wondering, what do you think explains the gaps in research when it comes to the scarce research in relation to ideas and social policy implementation?
Well, first of all, implementation in general is a bit, at least until recently, was quite understudied. I think there's more work now on street level bureaucrats, for example, people who implement policies in kind of the everyday life of people. There's more research about this, but in general, it's a field that is under theorized in a way. And there was, some really more descriptive empirical research, but I think it's less theorizing, but I think we are catching up now about this. And, implementation is really absolutely crucial. You cannot, a policy that exists, we have that in many different countries where you have, legislation is adopted, but then the policy as implemented is very different than what was planned and what is written down in the legislation. Some policies actually are never really implemented, and others are implemented in a way that totally transforms the original, I would say, nature of the policy. So I think that, this is just a lack of attention to implementation, at least in the past, but especially also the lack of theorizing. The people who studied policy implementation, a lot of them were located in the field of, public administration, which is a field where theorizing is not necessarily, developed. Also, yes, someone, Nana mentions that in her comment right now. There is also a methodological factor in terms of how do you study implementation. I think you need to interview probably bureaucrats and street-level bureaucrats. Bureaucrats are absolutely crucial when we talk about implementation. You can also, depending on the topic, you can interview, it can be teachers, it can be the students, it depends what type of policy you have. But you have to speak to people on the ground who implement the policy and also people who are affected by these policies, right? And a lot of the work on implementation right now, is on street-level bureaucrats and people who implement the policy. But we have also, importantly, to study how ordinary people perceive the new policy and how they adapt to it. And there is research about this, but often it's not understood as research about policy implementation. And we have to link these two streams of research together.
Thank you very much. That was a great response, because I have been thinking about it. I think sometimes we as people who are doing social policy seems to be focusing a lot more on the formulation, but then we know that a lot of the problems is really lying at the other end, where policies are not being implemented. And also because of issues around parties and political party systems and how even policies are even generated. Somebody says that they are making all the policies in parliament, and it's even though sometimes it's not necessarily the case. So thank you very much. I think that our time is up and we made a very good use of the time. It's been great having you, and I believe that the people here also enjoy the session. This is the last of our seminars for the semester, so we are happy to have you to be the one who delivered this one. And we will say thank you to everybody who joined, and we look forward to the seminars for the following semester as well. Thanks.
Thank you to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.